Bard's Tale is a 2004 action-adventure RPG made by In Exile Entertainment for the PlayStation 2. Now in Bard's Tale, you play the role of a summoner. A summoner is a traditional archetypal RPG-style character that uses the power of other entities in combat to augment his own abilities. An example of this could be the entire game series called Summoner. I actually made a video called, reviewing Summoner 2, but unlike in that franchise, in Bard's Tale, you summon characters in a more traditional way, where they show up and they fight alongside you. Think Pokemon, kind of, but with swords and axes and lots of cursing. So in Summoner, you don't really use magic, per se. But wait, if you're looking at the gameplay, you're like, wait, I think I see a magic bar. Well, that magic bar is for summoning. That's right, you, as the bard, don't throw fireballs or cast lightning bolts. You summon powerful elemental creatures who cast lightning bolts and throw fireballs. The gameplay plays out kind of like a top-down isometric action RPG. Think of X-Men Legends. It's a game where you go around and you bash bad guys. And when you're not doing that, you move around the map and you collect treasure chests and you talk to NPCs. As far as the combat, you're basically using melee weapons or you're using bows. That's about it. The combat itself can seem a little bit shallow because of that, but it depends largely on what type of units you summon and how you use them. There are some basic squad commands that come down to attack, follow me, and regroup, and simple things like that. But the gameplay is largely action focused. So now that you know sort of the basics of how the game works, let's talk about what works here and what doesn't work as well. Okay, let's get the negative stuff out of the way first, shall we? The game features a lot of redundant kind of levels. Now look, game devs, I understand where you're coming from. It's hard to make varied environments in a top-down isometric RPG. When you're only interacting with things as kind of like a 2D surface with some ladders that allow you to access a higher level of a building or something, it's hard to make levels that feel very different and fresh because things feel very flat. But even with that being said, you just feel like you're in the same place or in a place that's very similar for most of the game, especially in the first half of the game. In the second half of the game, you find these towers, and atop each tower, you find a themed enemy boss for the tower. But until that point, until you venture to these different towers that are themed in their own way, like you have a jungle tower and you have a snow-capped tower, you even have one segment later on in the game that's called the obligatory lava level. Before that, you're mostly just moving around forests and small hamlets. Forests where you move around and fight enemies, and small hamlets where you just move around and talk to NPCs and take on some of the very few side quests you can get into in the game. It just feels a little bit samey for the first half of the game until you really get into visiting those towers, which do feel a bit different. Now, why is that a problem? Because the game itself, I think, is just a little bit too long. Now look, this is a matter of preference. Some people love good, long games, but a lot of what you're doing in Bard's Tale is you're just engaged in combat. Round after round of combat. It can kind of feel like a beat 'em up. It can feel a little bit like X-Men Legends a little bit, where you're just moving around bashing these enemies, and while there is strategy involved with the combat, it can start to feel a little bit redundant over time. I think you could have shaved off some of that early game and made us feel like we're not in the same hamlet and forest again and again. I think a tighter experience would have been better for the Bard's Tale. Another potential downside of Bard's Tale is that I did notice some performance and slowdown issues. Now this might just be on my end, so I don't want to harp on this too much, but I did notice a lot of lag, especially when I was equipping certain items. Like, for instance, the flail would really take a long time to whack someone, so I just wound up not using it. Also, when the battles get really hectic, and they do later on, you can summon quite a few allies, and there are quite a few enemies on the other side, and when there are big powerful spells going on, the game can kind of chug. But that's just sort of performance-related stuff that I noticed. Graphically, I don't think the game is bad, but it uses the same graphics engine as Baldur's Gate, so if you're into that, you're into that. If you're not, I don't know what to tell you. Okay, so let's talk about what does work here. First of all, the gameplay is solid. So mostly what you're doing throughout this game is going around and beating up bad guys. It plays kind of like a beat 'em up. If you've seen my review of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Nightmare, it's kind of like that. You're just going around beating up bad guys, and you have some power, some special power-up moves you can unlock later on, like a charged bow attack or a charged shield attacks, a lot of charged attacks. But besides that, the strategy gets involved when you decide when to use your summons. There are two types of summons, okay? So there are these crystal-based summons that are really just like special attacks. You get these from defeating those tower bosses. Each tower boss then becomes a summonable crystal power-up maneuver. So one might heal your units, one might bind the enemies with branches, something like that. So those are really just occasional moves that you'll use when you're really in a bind, but you'll be relying on your traditional summons all throughout the game. So the more powerful your bard becomes, the more flutes and different types of instruments he'll be able to play. So he'll be able to summon more units to help him out. Now, deciding which units to send and when is very important. I've found that using like 2 melee units up front, followed by maybe a ranged unit behind them, and then a support unit behind that to heal and buff the units worked best if I can keep the enemy in front of me. You'll kind of set up battle lines with like a front lines, and then a ranged line, and then a support line. And it gets really tactical. It's pretty entertaining, actually, setting these things up and deciding sort of like your battle formation on the fly, unless you get surrounded, in which case it just turns into a scrum and you're in trouble. So try not to get surrounded at all costs, because when it's just a fist fight between you and like a dozen enemies, you might not make it out of that. You need to play the game a little bit more tactically. That's kind of implied, especially when you get later into the game, where the game really does challenge you, and it forces you to try different combinations of units to really find out what works best for your playstyle. Okay, well, the gameplay is good, but what do I really love about this game? Well, it's the audio. I know, I don't talk about audio all that much in my reviews, but this game, which is called Bard's Tale, obviously is heavily musically themed, and it delivers on that level. Notice how the Bard will go around and actually play tunes to summon each of his allies, because the units you're summoning are technically called tunes. Once the Bard plays the tune on his particular musical instrument, a unit will arrive. Now, as you gain access to different and more powerful musical instruments, the tunes that the Bard is playing changes. So if he's playing something on a flute, it's going to be different than if he's playing something on like a lyre or something. So the game actually records different tunes for each unit, for each musical instrument. There are literally dozens of tunes here that the game has recorded and played intricately in real time. So when you try to summon a unit, you have to wait for the Bard to run around and play, whatever musical tune he needs to, and it plays out in real time, and it's really fun. And each of the tunes matches the demeanor of the summon. So for instance, if you're summoning a big burly bodyguard, you're going to have a deep, rousing tune, and it's something that I think gives the game so much flair. And of course, on the audio front, the voice acting is great here. The narrator does an amazing job narrating the whole game. And in fact, the Bard is aware of the narrator telling his tale, and he often engages with banter, and he banters back and forth with the guy throughout.
It had come to this at last. One man, a poet and a rogue, with no friends to speak of, no one to mourn his passing, should it come to that.
But the audio here is great. Individual tunes, I can't say enough about it. I mean, just listen to one of these things. The last thing I want to touch on as a plus is the story and world building here. It's really fun. It's sort of like a traditional fantasy RPG setting. Think, maybe something Tolkien-esque, or if you want to go farther back than that, like kind of maybe like a Dungeons and Dragons style thing. Yes, I know Tolkien stories go back farther than that, but in the cultural zeitgeist, all right, anyway, I don't want to get into that discussion. Think about the Overlord, if you've ever played those games. I might do a review on that in the future. I don't know, we'll see. But the Overlord is sort of this comical, farcical, dark fairy tale, dark fantasy world, and that's what the Bard's Tale is. Yes, it's fanciful. Yes, there are heroes and knights, but everyone seems to be ridiculous. No one seems to be as heroic as they're supposed to be. You know, the villains aren't all they're cracked up to be. It's full of irony. It's full of twists on traditional fantasy tropes. This could very easily exist in the Overlord's universe. In fact, now that I think of it, there actually are quite a lot of parallels between this and Overlord. They're both action RPGs. In Overlord, you summon a bunch of little units to help you. Same thing you do in Bard's Tale. I don't know, maybe the Overlord dev team played Bard's Tale and then years later developed Overlord. I don't know. I don't have any inside information on that. I'm just pointing it out. In any event, the story is fun. The world building is great. And if you're into comedy and anything fantasy related, I think you'll enjoy this quite a bit. So what's the final verdict on Bard's Tale? While I do think the overall game could have been shortened and tightened up a bit, if you are up for a meaty 20-hour or so RPG with plenty of button mashing, beat 'em up action, Pokemon-style summoning, and a whole medieval tavern worth of swearing and dirty jokes, give Bard's Tale a try.
Think of it as a public service. I mean, who knows how cluttered these chests might become if I didn't do my part to help clean them out.
In hindsight, I'm surprised it took the bard this long to get his hands on Mary's chest.